Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Really interesting topic. I'm an Innovation Research Fellow in something called the National Innovation Centre for Rural Enterprise, which is part of Newcastle University. And my research focuses on the future planning and technology, the impact of technology on rural places. If we could get the next slide, please. So I put this in because A, I like the quote, but B, I thought it was a good way to kind of stimulate the debate. Technology is the answer, but what is the question? And to some extent, the local plan is that question. Technology is going to happen no matter what. But you've got an opportunity through the local plan to ask some of those questions of technology and shape how technology will be deployed in your area, rather than just being done to and have technology deployed from outside the area without anybody else saying what happens. So what I'm going to talk about is a kind of couple of projects that we've worked on as exemplars to give you some ideas of what's possible in the planning technique, and then look a bit further ahead. So I've kind of titled this 2035 Uttlesford, and what's the kind of next generation of technologies that is going to start to impact on the way you live, the way you work, and the way you kind of develop the area in the kind of medium to longer term. So for the first example, can you go to the next slide again? I'm going to talk about a project that we were involved in called Rural Enterprise Hubs. And we've seen in the last year, and indeed with this meeting tonight, that everybody's kind of switching to a new way of working, remote working. You know, Zoom is my life now, and I imagine it's the life of many other people. And this project, Rural Enterprise Hubs, was kind of started before COVID, but in a way, it's come of age in COVID era. So what we realized, spec flexible office space, and particularly office space with super fast broadband connectivity. And a lot of rural businesses now rely on this, even if you're not a kind of technology business, if you're trying to sell things through the internet, or indeed, if you're other things, trying to update information for government websites and things, you need that connectivity. So this picture is an rural enterprise hub in the headquarters of the Northumberland National Park. And originally they converted some of their building due to cutbacks. They lost some of their staff and had free space, so they converted it to office space to rent to the local community. They found it was so popular, they built these pods in the grounds of the estate, and 3 to begin with. And again, they were filled immediately with people wanting to come into them, and they've put another 3 in since then. So it's created this really vibrant network of small businesses in a rural area. And what happens is most rural businesses are very small, they're single people or 1 or 2 employees, and they don't necessarily have those networks of knowledge and being able to share information, not just about kind of strategy or markets, but just the kind of day-to-day stuff that you have over the water cooler when you're in a bigger business. It's also proved to be really useful way of getting information from outside, so from development organizations, local authorities. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, can I just ask if you could turn your microphone up slightly? If you could just turn your volume up a little bit.
Is that any better?
That's much better. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I'm in a remote rural area myself, and my internet connection isn't the greatest sometimes. So yeah, so they've proved to be very good at providing avenues for external advisors, particularly kind of things like Department for International Trade, trade advice, business advice, and things to come through there. So this is a kind of possible option for you as in the local plan to create these spaces for rural businesses to kind of develop. A lot of the businesses that move into these are home-based businesses, and they want that separation between home life and business life. And particularly if they want to employ and have an employee, they don't necessarily want that employee coming to their home as business. So that's kind of one idea, rural enterprise hubs. Go to the next slide, please. The second bit of research, which we're currently doing for DEFRA, looking at the impact of COVID, has focused on business space, or one of the big issues that's cropped up in the research is business space for manufacturing and creative and digital industries. Now, these are significant employers and contribute significantly to gross value added in rural areas. And what we also find, and this is true across Europe, is that they're dominated by family businesses. So over 75% of these businesses are owned or managed by families, and therefore they've got really strong ties to the local community. And this can be particularly difficult when they want to grow, and they find, they find difficulty in finding suitable premises to grow. What often happens is they either split themselves over multiple sites, and that's really inefficient, and that productivity is much lower, or else they have to migrate to the kind of urban fringe business parks or larger business premises away. So they lose that kind of connectivity to their local community where they've often, grown up or have a connection to, and also their employees then have to commute to the kind of area across that way. So what you often see in development plans and also developments is a focus on small business units, little trade units on the edge of towns and things like that. And there isn't these kind of slightly bigger premises that you have to go. This is often kind of made even worse by a settlement hierarchy approach to these kind of things, where that kind of development is focused on the bigger urban centres or bigger developments in the town. So you need some kind of flexibility within the local plan to be able to cater for these kind of businesses. There are not many of them, admittedly, but when they do occur, they make a really significant impact on the local economy and the local society for that particular area. So how do you deal with these kind of slightly uncertain events or infrequent events, but have a really big impact? Can I go to the next slide, please? So what we're going to talk about now is some slightly kind of further advanced or future issues. And one thing that's kind of coming quickly now, actually, is the fourth industrial revolution. And this is a shift away from you can see from the little schematic there, to a system of economy based on cyber-physical systems. So much more connectivity, much more data-driven, and much more automated. Now, a lot of this has been developed in response to the kind of the flaws in cities. So how do you police a city? How do you manage a city? How do you resource the city? Often with limited resources. So technology is seen as the answer to kind of square the circle of spending less, but getting more out of it. Now, a lot of the problems that cities face aren't necessarily the same that rural problems face. And often with the rural idyll, an idea of what's happening with rural is seen as the antidote, the way to get away from all this, to log out of the kind of internet and avoid these kind of connectivities. Can I go to the next slide, please? But we would argue in our centre that actually rural areas have a head start on some of these kind of technologies and developments. So if you think about distributed renewable energy systems, these are connected systems. A lot of the pioneers in this were islands, so the Scottish Islands, but also in the Mediterranean, places like that. So they're leading the way with this, and this is a real opportunity for rural areas. The other big technology that's coming around the corner is Internet of Things, and that's being demonstrated in precision farming and those kind of industries. They're really leading the way with this connectivity. And what these things do is changes the relationship between technology and society. The quote there from Usnink, it was really interesting around smart grids, that it turns passive consumers into active managers of commonable resources. And I'll talk in the next slide about how this can affect kind of development and things like the circular economy in rural areas and kind of retaining more of the value there. So what you need to think about is the link between these technologies and the societal scale problems that they're seeking to face, particularly in a rural area. And the other thing is the infrastructure, many of this is needed, will be rolled out in cities. We're seeing this with broadband. The incremental approach leaves rural areas kind of way behind in some kind of areas. So how can you kind of accommodate this? And this is probably a more tricky element than the previous two kind of instances. How do you incorporate this into planning, and how can you make... next slide, please. So one of the projects we've been working on to help kind of deliver this idea is smart rural communal buildings. The pictured here is my local village hall, and I was a treasurer of the village hall for 10 years. And if you're in a small rural community, trying to manage a kind of infrastructure like this is quite hard. You're constantly raising money, you're constantly repairing and things like this. And energy costs really are the biggest burden on the kind of community in this way. So what we're looking at now is using the best technologies, renewable energy, battery storage, and intelligent building management to maximize the kind of or minimize the costs of heating and lighting these kind of businesses. And we realized when we started this project, there were just in Northumberland, there's over 1,000 of these kind of village church halls, community buildings. And if you could connect the battery storage and the energy generation together, you've got a distributed power station. And as we've seen last summer, the grid capacity has to be managed. And at the moment, it's quite difficult to manage it. And in fact, they were paying people to take electricity out of the grid in the summer when there was too much solar and too much wind energy. And similarly, in the winter, when the demand is at the highest, you can sell this energy back to the grid at really quite incredible prices. And this then generates an income for these community buildings, which hopefully will make them self-sufficient financially as well as kind of power-wise across there. So it's a really good way of using the best of these technologies at a local level and ensuring the benefits are felt locally. Next slide, please. So some planning issues about the kind of fourth industrial revolution. The first one that we really find really interesting, and again, this is a kind of longer term issue, is connected and autonomous vehicles. They're always going to come tomorrow, but never quite get there. But I think they are definitely on the way and definitely going to make a significant impact on all areas. And in my opinion, a bigger impact on rural than perhaps the urban areas. So if you imagine an autonomous vehicle is something that will drive without any human intervention. So it will give mobility to everybody in society. So younger people who don't have driving licenses, older people who perhaps don't want to drive anymore, people with physical disabilities that mean they can't drive. So everyone gets the kind of mobility. This will probably fundamentally change the way we play, we commute, lifestyle decisions for old and young. But the problem is, where will these be located? So if a car can go wherever it wants without a driver, they won't be parked in urban areas. They'll move to the rural areas or the peri-urban, the edge of urban areas. So there's a risk at these kind of areas on the edge of big conurbations, and you're right on the heart of a couple of them, just become giant car parks and servicing centres for these autonomous vehicles. And again, there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be put in place to ensure that they can go anywhere. So you have to have 3D mapping, you have to have 5G connectivity to make them go. And if these aren't rolled out to rural areas, what will happen? The other issue from a planning point of view with this is that it's anticipated they won't be privately owned, they'll be on demand. So what do you do with all that space that's currently given over to car parking in housing, in city centres, in rural centres? There's going to be a lot more space available. Could we turn it to green space? Could we turn it to additional developments? Some properties, grow on space for businesses and things like that. So there's a lot of issues there. And again, this might happen within the life of this current plan. And therefore, is there possible to be flexible to be able to embrace these technologies when they emerge and deal with some of these issues that might occur? Next slide, please. The other one I'll quickly touch on, and I realise you've also got a housing track event as well, so I won't dwell too long on this one. This is the last one. We're in an ageing society, and rural areas are ageing faster. And the statistic there, 1 in 5 people now live to their 100th birthday, and 29% of the people born in 2011 will make it to 100. So we need homes and housing to be able to adapt to the circumstances of people as they go through their lives. One of the big problems in urban and rural areas is actually under-occupation of property. So people that empty nesters or retired people that have perhaps find difficult moving into different accommodation when they've been brought up families in there. But is it possible to houses that are flexible and able to adapt to different people's lives, or make it easier to make those changes to different areas or different housing? And is it possible to encourage more multi-generational developments that support all ages as they work through their lives? And again, technology's got a role in this to make sure that people can live better for longer, but it has to be driven by the individuals and not kind of determined by technology or the people behind technology. So how can we ensure that rural areas are also vibrant and economically and socially sustainable places for all ages from top to bottom? And I think that's my last of my slides. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much. That was incredibly